The transport smelled like recycled air and someone's poor decision to heat fish protein in the communal unit 3 hours before a combat drop. And Garrett Vale had long since made his peace with the fact that this was simply how the last chapter of his career was going to smell. Not glory, not gunpowder, not even the clean antiseptic bite of a properly maintained military vessel. Fish protein and the low electromagnetic hum of an aging Haverson-class hull working harder than its warranty had ever intended. He was sitting in the port jump seat with his kit bag wedged under his boots, and a contract brief glowing on the data slate balanced on his knee. And he had read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word of it, because the number at the bottom of the payment clause kept pulling his attention south like a compass needle, finding something worth finding. It was a significant number. It was, in fact, the specific number he had been doing arithmetic around for the better part of 3 years, adding and subtracting against costs, property values, the projected price of hiring 2 people who actually enjoyed working with their hands, the ongoing expense of feeding a dog. He had not yet acquired the dog. The dog was a retirement contingent variable, but he had a name picked out which he felt represented a reasonable level of commitment. "You've read that page 6 times," said Bez from the seat across the hold. "4 times. 6. I counted from the second time because the first time didn't look like reading, it looked like staring." Bez was Kelhari, which meant she had 4 arms, a respiratory system that processed nitrogen-heavy atmospheres with offensive efficiency, and an opinion on everything that she delivered with the calm certainty of someone who has never once considered that staying quiet might be an option. 2 of her arms were folded across her chest. The other 2 were occupied with the disassembly and reassembly of a sidearm she had already cleaned twice since boarding. It was, Garrett had come to understand, her version of meditation. "I'm reviewing the operational parameters," he said. "You're looking at the payment figure." "The payment figure is an operational parameter." She reassembled the sidearm with a click that sounded like punctuation. "How much longer?" "After this contract, never, that's the point." She made a sound that her translation collar rendered as something between acknowledgement and skepticism, which was an accurate representation of how Bez approached most of his statements about the future. Below them, below the transport's rattling hull and the thin buffer of upper atmosphere, Vareth IV was a planet that looked, from altitude, like someone had scattered crystal across terracotta. The Sorvine had built their colony in the equatorial belt, where the Vareth mineral deposits ran richest, and the cities caught the system's twin suns and threw the light back in every direction with what Garrett could only describe as architectural enthusiasm. It was a beautiful planet. It had been, for 11 years, a planet under Drethari compact occupation, and the compact had a talent for making beautiful things ugly that Garrett had encountered often enough in his career to no longer find it surprising, only depressing in a quiet, functional way that he had learned to carry without it slowing him down. The contract was legitimate. The cause was, by any reasonable measure, correct. The Sorvine were a people who deserved their world back, and the Compact was an organization that deserved whatever it was about to receive from a coalition of very tired mercenaries and a provisional liberation command that had been planning this operation for 3 years. Garrett had not taken the contract because the cause was correct. He had taken it because of the number at the bottom of the page. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself, because he had found over 20 years that the mercenaries who started believing they were heroes were the ones who made mistakes, and the ones who made mistakes were the ones who came home in the wrong configuration. The transport shuddered through a thermal layer. Someone in the forward compartment swore in Kelhari. Bez didn't look up from her sidearm. "We drop in 4 hours," she said. "I know. Try to read something different." Garrett looked down at the data slate. He turned the page. 18 months later, Garrett Vale was so tired that he had temporarily lost the ability to form opinions about architecture, which was unfortunate, because Vale had a great deal of it and appeared to expect admiration. The capital city of the liberated colony sat in the basin of a mineral valley, where every surface that could reflect light had been engineered to do exactly that, with the result that walking through it at midday was less like moving through a city and more like being inside the world's most aggressively optimistic chandelier. Garrett had been wearing his photoreactive visor indoors for 3 days. He had started to suspect this was a moral failing on the city's part. The provisional government complex was the worst offender. It had been built before the occupation in the Sorvine high civic style, which operated on the philosophical principle that a building should make you feel the specific smallness of being a single living thing inside a very large and consequential universe. And it achieved this with such commitment that Garrett felt it the moment he walked through the primary entrance, and kept feeling it at regular intervals all the way to the ceremonial chamber, where 7 officials in robes were waiting for him like a meeting that had been scheduled by someone who enjoyed meetings considerably more than he did. Bez was beside him. She had worn her formal vest, which had 4 arm openings and a decorative pattern that she described as traditional, and that Garrett privately suspected she had bought at the station port 2 days ago. She looked, by Kelhari standards, dignified. By human standards, she looked like 4 arms in a very nice vest. Garrett had decided not to share this observation. The governor was a Sorvine elder named Sarath Vale, whose bioluminescent markings ran a warm, steady gold along the lines of his jaw and temples, in what the cultural briefing had described as an expression of deep communal pride. He gave a speech. It was, in Garrett's careful internal assessment, a genuinely good speech. It honored the dead with specificity. It acknowledged the 18 months of grinding urban warfare without sanitizing them into something cleaner than they'd been. And it said several things about freedom that would have moved Garrett if he hadn't been calculating, for the 14th time, what percentage of the payment figure would go toward soil remediation on coastal agricultural land. Then it ended, and a different official stepped forward to explain the compensation arrangements. And this is where things became interesting in the specific way that Garrett associated with situations he would later describe to people who weren't there as complicated. The credit transfer, the official explained, was prepared and ready to be formalized. However, the Sorvine provisional government also wished to extend, in accordance with the ancient protocol of Liberator's honor, which the official described at some length, with evident reverence, using several phrases that the translation module rendered into basic with the slightly uncertain quality of a system doing its best with material it hadn't anticipated, an additional compensation. Traditional compensation, the highest form of gratitude their culture was formally equipped to express. The doors at the rear of the chamber opened. She walked in the way a person walks when they have learned that every entrance is also an evaluation, and the evaluation has consequences. She was young. She was Sorvine, which meant she looked human in the way that was convincing until it wasn't. The faint bioluminescent lines at her temples and collarbones were running so dim they were barely visible. The silver blue of them reduced to something closer to a rumor of light, and her secondary eyelids were doing something complicated at the outer corners of her otherwise perfectly calibrated expression. She was wearing formal presentation garments that fit her body the way borrowed things fit, technically correct, personally irrelevant. Her name, the governor said warmly, was Sarah. She was, the governor continued, Garrett's compensation. There was a pause. It was not a short pause. Garrett was aware during this pause of several things simultaneously. The governor's expression of genuine, generous pleasure. Sarah standing at the edge of the room with the stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was the safest country. And Bez to his left, making a sound that her translation collar processed and delivered to him as "oh." Just "oh." He looked at Bez. Bez had arranged her expression into something impressively neutral, which on a Kelhari face required active effort and which she was clearly providing. 2 of her hands were clasped behind her back. The other two had found each other at the front, fingers interlocked with the careful serenity of someone who has decided that folding their hands is the only way to prevent them from doing something their formal vest would not survive. The governor was still speaking. Sarah was trained in administrative systems, field medicine, and 3 disciplines of technical engineering. She was, and here the governor's markings brightened slightly with what Garrett now recognized as pride, worth considerably more than the credit figure in the original contract. He had been thoughtful in the selection. He hoped this communicated the depth of the Sorvine people's gratitude for everything Garrett and his team had sacrificed in service of their liberation. Garrett looked at the governor. He looked at Sarah. He looked at the official with the translation module who smiled helpfully. He took a breath. "I appreciate that," he said, with the careful enunciation of a man placing each word down like he is crossing a floor he does not entirely trust, enormously. "Could we discuss the credit transfer?" The governor did not become hostile. This, Garrett would later reflect, was the most exhausting part. A hostile opponent was a geometry he understood. You identified the angles, you applied the appropriate pressure, and the situation resolved in one direction or another. What the governor became instead was patient, and sincere, and carefully, exhaustingly confused, in the manner of a man who has prepared a very fine dinner and arrived at the table to find his guest explaining that they do not eat. They had been in the chamber for 40 minutes. The official with the translation module had stopped smiling and started looking at the ceiling periodically, which Garrett interpreted as a professional coping mechanism. The other 6 officials had arranged themselves into postures of respectful attention that were gradually acquiring the quality of people maintaining respectful attention through an event that was running considerably longer than the program had indicated. Bez had at some point acquired a glass of Sorvine ceremonial water from somewhere, and was drinking it with forearmed composure from a chair she had located at the side of the room, watching the proceedings with the frank interest of someone who had paid admission. "I want to be clear," Garrett said for the 3rd time, "that I am not expressing dissatisfaction with Sarah." "We are relieved," the governor said for the 3rd time, with what appeared to be genuine relief. "I am expressing a philosophical objection to the arrangement." The governor's markings did a slow, uncertain pulse. "You object to the honor." "I object to the structure of the honor. The honor itself, the intention, I understand. I respect it. And yet, Sarah was standing at the eastern edge of the room. She had not moved significantly in 40 minutes. She had, Garrett noticed, the extraordinary capacity for stillness of someone who had spent years learning that moving drew attention and attention was a variable with a poor historical average. Her bioluminescent markings were still running dim. He had started to understand, imprecisely but viscerally, that this meant something he didn't have the specific vocabulary for yet, and the not knowing of it sat in his chest like a splinter. He tried the direct approach one more time. "The credit transfer," he said. "The original figure, I'll take that." The governor exchanged a look with the financial official, whose expression delivered the answer approximately 2 seconds before his words did. The provisional government, it emerged, had structured the compensation package on the assumption that the traditional element would absorb the majority of the obligation. The credit reserve that remained was, the financial official explained with genuine regret, a partial figure. A gesture, not the contracted sum. Garrett received this information with the stillness of a man who has just been told the floor he was standing on was always a ceiling. "How partial?" he said. The figure the official gave him covered, by Garrett's rapid internal calculation, approximately 1 growing season on a coastal property, without the house, and without the dog. It was the financial equivalent of being handed 1 apple and told to enjoy the orchard. "Right," he said. He looked at Bez. Bez looked back at him over the rim of her ceremonial water with the expression of a person who has opinions and has made a considered decision to keep them entirely to herself for at least another few minutes. He asked then the question he had been not asking for 40 minutes, because asking it meant the answer existed. What happened to Sarah if he declined entirely? The governor answered him honestly, which Garrett had not fully prepared for. The freed captive resettlement program was running 14 months behind current demand. Temporary processing facilities. There was a list. Sarah's name would go on it. Garrett knew what temporary processing facilities looked like on post-conflict worlds. He had seen 3. They were called temporary with the same commitment to accuracy as his old commanding officer had called things quick, or painless, or almost over. The word temporary did a great deal of work that it was not structurally qualified to perform. He stood in the silence that followed and looked at the room. The governor, who genuinely believed he had done something generous. The officials, who had no framework for why this was still a conversation. Bez, who was now deliberately studying the ceiling. And Sarah, at the edge of everything, wearing an expression he was beginning to understand, was not the absence of feeling but its highest security setting, watching him the way a person watches a door that has always had a 50% chance of opening into something worse. He made the decision. He made it the way he made most decisions he didn't want quickly, so the alternatives didn't have time to make their full arguments. "She comes with me," he said. Then, with the emphasis of a man who intended to repeat this as many times as the universe required, not as property, not as compensation, because the alternative is a 14-month list, and I've seen those lists. The governor's markings brightened with satisfaction, which was the wrong response for the right reasons, and Garrett decided not to correct the interpretation just yet. He looked at Sarah. She was watching him. Her secondary eyelids moved once slowly. "I understand," she said. It was the most precisely constructed sentence he had ever heard. It was 2 words long and contained something that would take him considerably longer than the transit home to read correctly. He filed it in the part of himself where he put things that mattered, which was getting crowded lately, and turned back to the governor to begin the paperwork. The Meridian Clause was not a beautiful ship. Garrett had never pretended otherwise. She was a mid-range cargo hauler with a secondary cabin that smelled like the previous owner's questionable taste in synthetic incense. A navigation system that expressed strong opinions about certain jump routes by making a sound like a disappointed relative. And a water recycler in the port corridor that worked perfectly except on Tuesdays, for reasons that 3 separate engineers had investigated and declined to explain. She was, in every measurable way, adequate. Garrett had owned her for 9 years and felt about her the way he felt about most things that had kept him alive. A respect too complicated to be called affection, and too durable to be called anything less. He showed Sarah the secondary cabin on the first day. He explained the lock. He explained that it operated from the inside, that he had no key for it, that this was intentional. She listened to all of it with the focused attention she applied to everything he said, which he was learning was not the attention of someone taking orders, but of someone conducting an ongoing experiment in whether what a person said and what they meant were, in his particular case, the same thing. She said she understood. He believed this time that she meant it about 40%. Bez had claimed the crew bunk in the forward compartment with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this since Vale and had simply been waiting for the boarding ramp to close before announcing it as settled. She had also, within the first 6 hours of transit, reorganized the communal galley on the grounds that its original organization was, in her word, philosophical, by which she meant it made sense only to someone who had stopped caring about finding things in a hurry. Garrett had intended to object. He had looked at the galley, then at Bez, then at the galley again, and determined that the argument had a poor probability of achieving anything except making the galley feel uncomfortable about itself. On the second day, Sarah reorganized the ship's inventory system. She did it quietly during the 3rd watch, while Garrett was running navigation checks and Bez was doing whatever Bez did during her off hours, which involved at minimum 2 of her arms and a privacy setting on her bunk console that Garrett had learned not to question. He found the reorganized system in the morning, sat with it for 10 minutes, and experienced the specific irritation of someone whose inefficiency has been made visible without their consent. Everything was where it should be. Routing was logical. The cross-referencing alone would save him hours over the course of a standard transit. He wanted to find a flaw in it for reasons that were not entirely rational, and he couldn't. And he closed the console and went to make coffee and stood in the galley for a while thinking about nothing in particular. "She fixed the inventory," he said when Bez appeared. "I know, she fixed mine too. You have an inventory system. I have a weapons inventory system. She reorganized it by function and frequency of use." Bez accepted the coffee he handed her with 2 of her hands. The other 2 were occupied with breakfast. "I gave her full marks. She put the sidearm I use most in the front position." "How does she know which one you use most?" "She asked me," Bez said, as though this were information that should reconfigure something in his thinking, which it did, in a quiet way he didn't fully process until later. The days settled into a rhythm that was not exactly comfortable, but was becoming less angular. Sarah ate at the communal table by the 4th day, no longer waiting to be invited, and not yet entirely at ease, occupying the middle ground of someone who has decided to extend tentative credit to a situation without yet closing the loan. She spoke when she had something to say, which turned out to be often. She had, beneath the careful architecture of her silences, a dry and precise sense of observation that surfaced in small moments. A single sentence, perfectly placed, that reframed something Garrett had been looking at from the wrong angle. The first time she made Bez laugh, genuinely and without warning, Garrett watched it happen with the expression of a man witnessing a geological event he hadn't known was scheduled. He found her in the observation bay on the night of the 17th day. The stars outside were running the long, unwavering light of deep transit, no system close enough to have color, just the ancient and indifferent scatter of everything that existed before them and would exist considerably after. She was sitting in the dark with her knees drawn up and her bioluminescent markings moving in a pattern he hadn't seen before, something between silver and deep violet that traveled slowly along her collarbone and up toward her jaw, and he almost turned back because the moment had the texture of something private. He didn't turn back. He sat on the other end of the bench and they stayed in the quiet together, which was different from silence in a way he couldn't have explained technically but felt accurately. "The farm," she said, eventually. He looked at her. "You mentioned it to Bez, what coast?" He told her. He started briefly, with the intention of being brief, and then found himself not being brief because the farm had been in his head for 3 years, and had accumulated detail the way long-held hopes do. The slope of the land toward the water. The specific variety of apple he'd decided on after research he would never admit to conducting. The name he'd chosen for the dog, which was an old word from a language his grandmother had spoken, and which meant, roughly, steady. Sarah listened. Her markings moved. Outside, the stars held their positions with the patience of things that have never needed to go anywhere. "It sounds," she said quietly, "like a place a person could stop being afraid." He didn't answer immediately. He sat with the sentence, with what it contained, with the careful way she had said it, not about herself, not quite, but with the precision of someone describing a country they have been standing at the border of for a very long time. "That's the idea," he said. She nodded once and looked back at the stars, and her markings shifted into something slower and steadier, and the meridian claws kept moving through the dark with its recycler making its Tuesday sound on